The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/YumiCapri, and I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PMEntertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth. And our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support. Now, let's clear these dungeons of some mobs. Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 12th level of the RPG Cave. I am one of your hosts, your level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely Saturday morning?
I'm doing great, man. Just chilling. I did a little bit of groceries this morning, a little bit of errands, trying to wrap that up, and so I'm free for the rest of the day, and I'm ready to talk about more RPGs.
Very
Can't
nice,
wait.
My friend. How many cups of coffee have you had today, though?
Just one.
Okay.
Whoa. I'll get my second one right after. I know.
Conservative.
Being a little conservative today, so.
I can't believe it. Well, clearly, like you're dealing with tired Ryan here, and I'm expecting you to bring the hype, and you're only on one cup of coffee. I don't know about this show today. Of course, though, let's clear the dungeon of all these pesky mobs, because we got some housekeeping to do. First up, of course, if you like what we do and you want to support us, there's a number of ways you can do that. Number one, you can subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the things, so check us out there. You also, if you want to see our beautiful faces, youtube.com/YumiCapri. You can watch the video version every single week, because it goes up every Saturday morning there. And again, if you're having a hard time finding it on the site, because we have, a bajillion things going up every week on the YouTube channel, of course, if you go to the RPG Cave playlist, all the episodes will be categorized there. And we've also since added all of the old episodes of the RPG Cave as well. So the old channel has been closed down. They've all been moved over. So you can go check us out there. Also, Garret, we got to celebrate a milestone that we've been celebrating all week this week on the channel. We've finally hit 1,000 viewed hours on our channel.
Nice.
Which is very exciting.
Congrats on that.
Well, thank you. So I'm so thankful, of course, for everyone who comes out, who messages us about the video version. Even though I know when you come watch the video version, it doesn't usually have a whole lot of views. People are watching till the end. They're commenting on it. They're letting us know on the Discord that they're really enjoying it. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been checking out the YouTube channel as of late and for supporting us all this way. Speaking of supporting us, there is one other way you can do that as well. If you want early access to this and all of our shows, you can head over to patreon.com/YumiCapri. Throw a little tip in the old tip jar, and out comes content. You get the exclusive Yumi and Capri podcast, which just came out last week from the time you're listening to this, because we did a new episode of that, as well as the Patreon podcast for Patrons podcast. All right, Garret, it's time to read from the sacred texts. We got a doozy this week. People were really excited about this one when we told people we were doing this episode, and we saw that in the amount of questions we got this week. Final Fantasy VII. It's finally here. It's finally time to talk about Final Fantasy VII. Garret, you've been hinting at this for weeks on Shack.
Yes.
Because you've been talking about how you've been playing it for the first time. I'm a Final Fantasy VII veteran. If you're watching the video version, here is my copy of Final Fantasy VII that I bought in 1998 that I still have for PlayStation 1. I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy VII, so I'm excited to get into this with you today. So before we jump in, Garret, of course, as always, we got some fun facts to kind of go over. So
let's get
but
through
less
the
fun
facts.
facts than usual this time around. Because it's only one game, Garret. There's just less to talk about. So, of course, many people know kind of the story of the development of Final Fantasy VII, where development really started all the way back in 1994 for this game, all the way back on the Super Famicom, because this was originally not supposed to be a PlayStation game or even a game in 3D. This was a game that was supposed to be a 2D game on the Super Famicom, like the other Final Fantasy games that are also on the Super Nintendo, essentially. But with Chrono Trigger coming out around the time that development started, because we talked about that on the Chrono Trigger episode a little bit, when Chrono Trigger was nearing its final development phases, essentially the Final Fantasy VII team moved over to help with Chrono Trigger, essentially to get that game kind of out the door, to help polish it and make sure it's, as awesome as possible. Especially because when we talked about Chrono Trigger, they really were trying to make that be like the ultimate RPG, and have it be like the best RPG of all time. So they wanted to make sure as many people were on that game as possible. But in 1995, the development team actually resumed development on Final Fantasy VII, and they actually ended up developing a 2D prototype of the game. So there is actually a 2D version of Final Fantasy VII that exists somewhere in some, crazy Square Enix vault somewhere. I would have loved to see kind of what that would have looked like. However, as the scope of the project grew beyond the point where they could continue to do this as a 2D game, or even just on a cartridge-based console in general, the project needed to either be moved to either a CD-based console or Nintendo's new console, the N64. So Square actually created a prototype for the N64 as well in 3D to utilize the 64DD drive for the N64. Garrett, do you know what the 64DD drive for the N64 is?
I have no idea, but it sounds hilarious. So, is it a disk drive?
Yeah, so it was actually an add-on similar to the Famicom disk system, which we talked about a couple times on the show, where essentially it would attach to the bottom of your N64. You'd put CDs in it. In fact, it actually did come out, and it was very rare in North America. I think there was only less than 20 of them in North America. And then in Japan, there were a ton of them, and there were games that took advantage of it, like F-Zero. For example, on N64, you could create your own levels and stuff like that in F-Zero, and then you'd save them to the disc. It was really cool.
Interesting.
So it was good to utilize basically the extra power from that disc drive to basically make it so the game would actually run properly. However, they found between the cost of cartridges for N64, because they were very expensive for developers to produce, combined with the fact that there was just so much more limited disk space versus a CD console, that they ultimately decided to take the project to PlayStation instead. And then
that's crazy.
The history was written with Final Fantasy ever since, because Final Fantasy from that point on, because before this, you have to remember, Final Fantasy was essentially pretty much just a Nintendo-only game.
Right.
It only released on either Game Boy or NES or SNES, so we didn't actually ever see it release on other consoles. And then for a long time, it took us till we finally got to see Final Fantasy games come to other consoles again, where it was PlayStation exclusive for forever. And it was all because of this. It was because of this moment. They also shopped around the idea of doing a version for Sega Saturn, but that eventually got canceled as well. Mainly because around the time that the game was going to come out, it looked like the Saturn was starting to fail a little bit, and that's why they didn't kind of go in that direction. So the game itself released on PlayStation 1 in Japan on January 31st, 1997, and on September 7th, 1997 here in North America. And again, the version I showed in the video is the Greatest Hits version, which we got a year later, which is when the game got a price drop, which was
How many discs are in there? Is there 20 of them?
It's 3 discs. It's only three discs. It's a shorter. It's actually the least number of discs for a Final Fantasy mainline game for PlayStation 1. Because
it's not like Doom or something like that on PC where it's like 9 discs.
9 floppy disks. No,
pretty much.
But the other 2 Final Fantasy games are 4 discs, Garrett. And then I remember back in the day, they would brag about that. They'd be like, "Man, this game is 4 discs. It must be so long. There's so much value in this game. You got to check it out right now."
That's a good incentive.
The hilarious thing about Final Fantasy VII's third disc is it's literally just the final area and then the open world for the rest of the game. It's there's no other content. It's literally just the end of the game is on the third disc essentially. So there you go. So that's when Final Fantasy VII came out. Again, it came out the same year in North America, but we had a pretty long delay. But hype was high for this game. People were very excited for Final Fantasy VII. In fact, as kind of some of the reviews on the box kind of talk about here is it was really a groundbreaking game as far as visuals at the time. Because even though we kind of chuckle at the visuals now because they look very silly, but at the time it came out in 1997, it was a gorgeous game. It looked incredible, especially like the cinematics in particular. Like, you didn't have anything else like that back then.
Well, what's the gap between Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII? How many years is that?
I think it's about 5 years, because if memory serves, I think it came out in 93.
Okay,
92 or 93. I'm blanking on the date off the top of my head.
And they make the decision of going from 2D to 3D, from Nintendo to PlayStation, all in that time frame. Plus, helping with Chrono Trigger, they were pretty busy.
Yeah. No kidding, yeah.
And
again, it was a long time in the making, but when it finally came out, I think it was well worth it. People really liked this game. Also, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to mention this real quick in the quick facts now as well. They also announced in 2003 the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. This, of course, was announced when they announced the Advent Children movie. This is when they were announced they're going to expand the universe with a bunch of different games and movies, and there are currently 9 releases so far in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. That includes 2 movies and 7 games.
Oh.
And that also includes part 1 of Final Fantasy VII Remake, because it is technically part of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. But we'll talk about those a little bit more a little bit later. But Garrett, real quick, I want to get your thoughts on Final Fantasy VII, because I know you're pretty early in it. You've talked about it a lot on Shaq over the last couple weeks. What do you think about this game so far? And where are you to kind of give the listeners like an idea as to where you are in the game?
Okay, so where I'm at right now is I'm out in the open world now, outside of Midgar. I just passed I think it's the Mithril Mine. I met some agents over there. I forgot what they were called, but they're after Sephiroth as well.
Okay, the Turks?
The Turks, that's it. I was like, why are you calling them the Turks? Anyways.
It's a whole thing.
It's like a random like country. I was like, okay, sure. And then I just got outside of that mine, and I went to a side village outside of Midgar that's actually run in the dumps. It's like a polluted, heavy, impacted town, and I just saved a little girl from a huge sea monster.
Okay.
And that's where I'm at right now.
Okay.
So my thoughts. It is it's a product of its time.
Yep.
I think you have to, when you play it for the first time now, if you have not played it ever before, you have to understand that like it's aged, and it's not like as aged as well as the 2D Final Fantasy games or as any other kind of like SNES games, right? These are 3D graphics, of course, at the time, probably beautiful visually, but now, I mean, compared to what we see, these are just like 3D polygons.
They just look like just a bunch of shapes just randomly like put together, these character models.
Yeah.
It's very silly.
It's actually pretty funny. I think it's a little funny to see how these characters are so serious, but I'm like, but they're just polygon shapes. Like, how can I take them seriously? But yeah, I love the tone of this game for sure. It has this dark themes to it. I love like how the Shinra Corporation's in there and it's talking about how they're destroying the planet and everything, and it's like kind of symbolizes what we're doing to society right now, to be honest with you, how dark and bleak it is. I enjoy the characters as well. Cloud is just a cool guy. He is just out there being all silent and quiet, and then also being super powerful and everything. So I do enjoy Cloud a lot. He has that swagger, I guess you could say. I do very much enjoy the other characters as well, including Tifa and Eris. But yeah, I'm going through this little by little, just because I don't want to burn myself or anything like that in this game. I'm playing other games while I'm going through it. Because I just want to appreciate what I'm playing than just like, oh, okay, let me just go to this next scene of this old game that like everyone just like adores and praise. And it's like, no, just taking my time, making sure I catch all the scenes, making sure I understand what the relationships are. Sephiroth has a very interesting background story so far. But yeah, overall, it's a wait and see approach for me. I'm still taking it in. I'm not saying it's like I definitely not saying it's my favorite all time video game, but I'm not saying it's like it's not a bad game. It's just an aged game. Yeah, like it's an aged good game.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Like I can imagine like if you're playing it for the first time today, like the classic version, it's got to be it's got to be so much harder to get into a game like that now than it would have been, to play it in the time. Like it's Final Fantasy VII is such a game of its time. It's such a game of 1997. It essentially represents like some of the best in-game design from that era, and it's aged in not a great way. I think the story hasn't really aged poorly. I think the story is the main reason to keep playing it and the thing that holds up the best. And then the second would probably be the combat, which we'll talk about a little bit in mechanics in a bit. But I think with the visually speaking, it's hard to go back to. There's also some clunkiness with some of the characters, not the character design, the quest design, as well as kind of like figuring out where to go next, for example, without a guide. It's tricky.
It's 3D polygon characters in a 2D sprite background, and it's just so hard to know what's a wall and what can I climb up. Luckily, in the Switch version and like the newest versions or whatever, you click a button and there's actually indicators like, oh, this is like you can climb here, you can go to this door here. So that's actually pretty nice.
So, fun fact, Garrett. That option's actually in the original game. If you just press the select button on the DualShock controller, it shows the same.
That's much better.
Yeah, they did that back in the day as well. Because again, like when I first played it for the very first time on PS1, that was a big problem. Where like some areas you're like, where's this exact area I need to go to on this like very samey looking, background. And the backgrounds were a little bit easier to navigate if you played the game on a CRT back in the day, like you played it on the original one. Because again, it was really very much developed for, a muddier TV, like something that's not as clean and crisp as an LCD screen. And for some reason, it just made it a little bit easier to kind of like see through some of these these still backgrounds, or they didn't look nearly as like poor looking as you see them now, where they kind of look, weird and out of place when you play.
The polygon in like a cut like piece of paper or something like that in the back. That's what I feel like it looks like.
Yeah.
Now.
So my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII. Back in the day when I first played it, again in 1998, I actually thought it was one of my all-time favorite games. It was in my top 5. I loved it to death, but over time my cognitions really changed on the game because, first of all, I played through Final Fantasy VII probably about 10 times throughout my life. I played it a ton because I really love Final Fantasy VII because I love it for the story. But I definitely agree that in the sense that it hasn't aged in a lot of it aged well in a lot of different areas. So it's definitely kind of fallen out of even my top 25 favorite games of all time. I still really like it. It's still kind of in my top 50, but like. There are so many games. There's even games from that era that hold up so much better than that game, and again, it was just. I think it was just the release timing of Final Fantasy VII because again, it came out. If this was a game that came out maybe 3 years later, and kind of took advantage of some of the more advanced graphics that we saw in Final Fantasy VIII or IX, I think it would be a game that might still be in my top 5 favorite games of all time because it wouldn't have aged as poorly as this version of the game has. So I definitely think it's harder to go back to. But I kind of want to talk real quickly about kind of how I decided to actually pick up Final Fantasy VII because I know at the time, Garrett, you were probably very young when Final Fantasy VII came out.
I was 3.
Yeah, so you weren't really like hearing people being excited about it or anything like that. The reason I'd heard about Final Fantasy VII, and I know my brother Kyle actually listens to the podcast, so I wanted to tell this story real quick, is that he would actually go over to his friend Jay's place all the time, and he would actually go over and watch Jay play a whole bunch of RPGs, and they would kind of like talk about them together. And he would come back home all the time after like going over to Jay's place for like 4 or 5 hours and be like, "Oh my God, we were playing Final Fantasy VII today, and like this and happened." And I'm not talking about the specific moments here because there's a bunch of spoilery stuff that I don't want to spoil. And he sounded like the ravings of a madman when he would talk about Final Fantasy VII, but he was like so excited about it. Like he was so like visually excited about what was happening with this game. And I could tell that he just really loved it. And I was like, oh, I wonder what this game's all about. I haven't really heard anything about this Final Fantasy VII game. And then that's when I started to see more commercials about Final Fantasy VII. And also that was when websites started to become a thing, and more people were using the internet. So I was already using the internet quite a bit at that time frame, and I did a lot of research about Final Fantasy VII. And then as soon as the Greatest Hits version came out, I went out and got it right away. Like I remember we were on like a road trip in Texas, and then we stopped by a random game store and saw the greatest hits version just sitting there. I was like, I've got $30 on me. Let's pick this up and bring it home with me. This is the second game I ever bought for my PlayStation 1. If you can.
Oh wow.
Yeah, the first was Lunar, which we'll talk about a little bit on next week's episode. Spoilers for next week. So that was kind of my history with Final Fantasy VII and how I got into it. And it was really like the very first like game on PlayStation 1 like I kind of fell in love with, because again, Lunar I'd already played before on Sega CD, and I think the Sega CD version of that game's a little bit better. So I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy VII. I loved the story and the tone and everything about it. It really reminded me of all the great points of the older Final Fantasy games, especially with the battle system in particular, which I really like from the older Final Fantasy games, and it just so happens that it uses a very similar one in Final Fantasy VII, and I loved this game to pieces. But we should talk about, because you brought up the Switch version, Garrett, where the best place to play this game is, because Final Fantasy VII is on a bajillion different platforms. You can play
it on everything.
You can play it on PS1. It was a downloadable game on PlayStation 3 and Vita and PSP, so you can play it on all those places. You can also play it on PC, because they released the IDOS actually did the the PC version back in the day instead of Square Enix. So they actually that port was like very different from the console port. In fact, it was actually worse than the PlayStation version, which, funny enough, the version that actually got ported to the Switch, PS4, and Xbox is the IDOS PC version and not the original console version. I mean, there's no changes with the story or anything like that, but just there are some visual differences and stuff like that. So, so, Garrett, do you think Switch is a good place to play this game? What do you think about playing it on Switch?
The Switch is fine. And again, if you have like an original copy, you got PlayStation 1 and you got a CRT TV and get that original experience, then go for it. I think why I like it, why I like playing on Switch is two things. One, it's handheld, so I can just like take it with me on the go and just play it around just like a Vita. But also, I don't know if it's on Vita or anything else. There's a fast forward version. There's like a ×3 speed up.
The speed up version like effects were actually added in the PC Steam re-release, and then they added those to the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch version. So it's only in those games.
Okay, it's really nice because you go through those battles pretty quick. If it's an easy battle, you just press A, like just go through and attack the monsters, and it's like, oh man, I'm done with this battle in like 3 seconds instead of like 2 minutes.
Right.
So I do enjoy the speed up. There's also like an invincibility button, and I keep accidentally hitting it. I don't mean to hit it, but I was like, oh, dang it, I don't want to.
It is in a very easy to hit place, even on like, because I played it on PlayStation 4. And it was a similar boat where it was like it's like an easy to hit button that you just hit like by accident sometimes. And you're like, oh crap! Now even if you turn it off, you've got like full limit bars for all your characters, because it also does that too. Yeah. So. Yeah,
but I say Switch version is a really good place to play this game.
Yeah, and to your point, I think the modern additions to the game actually help speed the game along in a good way. Or play it at your own pace, I think. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think, like, either the Switch version, or if you don't have a Switch, like PS4, Xbox One, PC, like, the current version, I think, is probably the best way to play it these days. Again, if you have to your point, Garrett, if you have an old CRT and, a PlayStation 1, then that's actually a really good option too, or a PlayStation 2, because I think that's probably the second best way to play it, just because, again, it's going to be a little bit easier to navigate, and it's going to look like pretty crisp on some of those screens. So I definitely recommend that method. And then kind of at the bottom, I would say the PlayStation Classics version. Nothing wrong with that version. It's just that it doesn't really have the modern upgrades that we talked about, or it doesn't look as good as you're playing it on a CRT. So as much as fun as I would have wanted to have, playing it on Vita, because Vita is great, Garrett. We love the Vita on this show.
Oh, yeah, Vita is fantastic.
It's probably not the version that I would say to go play. So
right.
There you go. Well, let's start getting into the nitty-gritty about Final Fantasy VII. We should talk about some of the mechanics, as we do on the show, because we love talking about mechanics. So, Garrett, the battle system in this game, since I know you're pretty new to Final Fantasy, is very similar to the battle system in all the older Final Fantasy games. Of course, it's a turn-based JRPG for those that haven't played it. And it uses what's referred to as the active battle time system, which by default is set to basically be turned off, essentially, where like a bar will kind of fill up, and then that's when people's turns will essentially happen. But then as you're picking your actions by default, like the timer stops. But if you're a crazy person like me, you turn that off so that, you know, your enemies also get turns while you're also prepping your own turns.
I think that's what I'm doing. I didn't know that was an option.
It is an option. It's actually the default
I'll have to
option
look
too,
into
so
it.
I'm amazed you actually would have changed it. Or and maybe it's not on the Switch version. I don't know. But on the original version of the game, the default version is to wait. It's referred to as wait for active time battle. So the game essentially pauses while you're basically selecting your moves, which helps a little bit later on when you're chaining some crazy moves together, involving some of the materia later in the game. Speaking of materia, segue, one of the things I really like about the gameplay, or one of my favorite mechanics of this game, is the materia system, where there's no set classes for any of your characters. You'll basically collect these like little like orbs essentially that basically give your party members different abilities, and you essentially slot them into your gear. So either your weapon or basically like your bangle or whatever like arm accessory that you have of choice for your particular character. And then those materia essentially grow as you play through the game, and that's how you unlock other spells, and you can very easily change them between the characters. Like I really like the materia system and just the flexibility of it, how like regardless of what party members you want to bring with you, you essentially have like the same sort of like skill sets available to you, and you can kind of just mix and match them however you want to. And those materials also affect the stats of that particular character. Like if you equip too many magic materia on a person, you'll have tons of mana points, but you'll have like low hit points and low defense. So it kind of goes both ways. You kind of have to like balance it. Which I thought was just like super interesting. But what do you think about some of the mechanics in Final Fantasy VII, Garrett? I'm curious to know what your opinion is now that they are playing it for the first time.
It's pretty solid. I did play like Final Fantasy IV for a good while on Vita, so it reminds me a lot of that battle system. I said is like active time battle sequence, but like as you said, you got to be on your toes. And like I didn't know about the option of like pausing it when you get to your move, because I feel like every time when I'm battling, that enemy is going and like it's like oh dang, I'm gonna have to attack right now or I'm gonna be screwed. So it's pretty good. It's a very solid turn-based strategy gameplay there. I do love the materia part as well, as you said. I haven't gone really too deep into like the strategy of materia as much, but I do like how it's very flexible and very versatile between all the characters, and you can just add whatever magic spells or whatever you want to those characters and just go into battle. But yeah, so far so good. I really enjoy the combat of this game. Yeah. It's very solid.
It's really fun. Of course, you've got random battles in this game. Of course, it was very much a game of its time, because I mean that's what most of the RPGs were doing back then. Even though like Chrono Trigger was kind of one of the games that really like forced kind of developers to kind of think outside the box a little bit as far as random battles were concerned. But there's a lot of random battles, and sometimes it's one of those games too where you'll walk like 2 feet and then another random battle happens, and then
it's like I'm in the Pokemon cave. Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
like
and
all the Zubats.
It's totally random depending on, and it doesn't matter where you are on the map or anything like that. Like you'll just hit random battles, like regardless of where you go. So it is very much a thing. There's also, and I think you noticed this a little near the beginning of the game, Garrett. There's dialogue choices in this game that
is.
How many times did you see like dialogue choices in like older games like this that actually affect things? And Garrett, I'm not going to spoil how it affects things, although it doesn't affect things in kind of a major way. It kind of affects kind of the love interest more than anything.
Oh, the romancing. Yeah, nice.
It's got a little bit of romance in this game, which we kind of love. In fact, now that we're on the subject, real quick, Garrett, who's your waifu in this game?
I don't think I've chosen one, but I'm thinking more Eris versus Tifa at this point, but that could change. Like my mind could change a lot. The one thing I did not care, and I guess we'll go to the least part later, but we could talk about that later. Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah. I mean, I had to ask that question because the Final Fantasy VII community is like kind of very split on this. Because
apparently.
You've got two choices, although There are essentially four choices, because there's another party member you haven't unlocked yet, as well as one of the a very a different character that you can do this with too. That you wouldn't normally.
I'm gonna have to find these others.
Yeah, so you'll find out when you get later in the game, Garrett. But it's just it's very silly, and it's something that again we didn't really see that often at that time. But there's dialogue choices, which I thought again was just like really cool and interesting and kind of weird at the time, because again you didn't really like the first time I played it was like one of the first games I ever played with dialogue choices, because it's not as prevalent as it was now back in 1998. Also, there are some points in the game that essentially, if you don't, you essentially get locked into those areas, and if you don't grind enough, if you're not powerful enough in that area, and you essentially
that's true
lose all your items, you are kind of screwed. So it means you can't leave that area, and you can't go buy more items. And you just have to somehow get through it or restart the game over again, which is that's fun. So
wow.
If you're playing the game for the first time, I would highly recommend, of course, making sure to save your game as often as possible.
Save a lot,
especially with multiple save slots, just to be safe. It's definitely one of those games. Again, you saw this from time to time in some of these older titles, and unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII is one of those games. But otherwise, I think the boss design in Final Fantasy VII is really interesting. You fight some really cool bosses. You fight a lot of bosses in this game as well. And there's some crazy stuff, especially towards the end of the game too, because there are these like end game bosses as well, and they have like really unique and cool and complex mechanics to them. Which again, you didn't really see that often in some of these older games. So I loved all that stuff. Of course, though, the one other thing that the Final Fantasy VII combat gave us, Garrett, was limit breaks. We have to talk about limit breaks. So, of course, there's a limit bar that builds up over combat, and essentially you can use it to basically pull off a really cool move, depending on the character who basically builds up the limit break. And it builds either as you take damage or as you dish out damage. And the taking damage part fills up a little bit slower than you dealing damage. But if you get hit by like a really big attack, you'll like just shoot up, which is just super cool. And then you essentially unlock the limit break, like more limit breaks as you go throughout the game, and they all have like really interesting designs and stuff like that. Each character also has an ultimate limit break later in the game that does like a crazy thing. With some of them would have like really over the top animations and stuff like that. So
cool.
Yeah, so I love kind of the evolution of that. But what do you think about limit breaks, Garrett, and how they affect combat?
I mean, it's awesome. I mean, they're just ultimate attacks. I see them a lot in other RPGs, and of course, probably they borrowed it from Final Fantasy VII or the Final Fantasy games in general, so I'm not too surprised. But I enjoy them. They're a nice little break in between battles. It's not just like repetitive, okay, let's do magic, okay, let's do attack, okay. Like limit breaks breaks the flow a little bit, where, okay, if you're really in trouble, well, that's okay, because your limit breaks will be a little bit faster gauging up in the bar, and then you're ready to go. I really like having different party members that do different things with limit breaks, like with Eris and all the healing one stuff. Like, she is essential in my party to just make sure I heal a lot in my party. And Cloud as well, with it does a massive amount of damage with the Buster Sword, and I like Tifa's little limit break too, where it's like a little slot machine going on. That's the very first one you get, and it's actually pretty creative how they just go through each individual character. Like, okay, what is going to be the ultimate attacks for this character? And they really did a good job of handcrafting the limit breaks.
And they're like totally different for each character too, which is awesome. Yeah. And some of them have like completely different mechanics, like Tifa's slot machine, or again, like some of the later characters you get, like they have like really weird like limit break conditions and stuff like that, as well as like how you go do them is different. So like, yeah, like I thought the complexity of the limit break system was like really cool. So that's one of the things I like about that. But we should probably talk a little bit, Garrett. I hinted about this a little bit earlier with the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. We should talk about the legacy of Final Fantasy VII.
There's so many.
There's so much stuff that's happened since the game came out. It all kind of stemmed from the movie Advent Children, which was essentially a movie sequel to the end of Final Fantasy VII. So the end of Final Fantasy VII ends in a way that I'm not going to spoil, but people wanted some, closure with some of the characters. So they ended up doing a movie that kind of, tells the stories of what happens after after the main game, essentially. It takes place like 2 years later. And again, I won't get into the plot because it spoils some of the stuff from the main game. So there's that. We also got a whole bunch of games, including Before Crisis, which was a mobile game all about the formation of your favorite group of all time, Garrett, the Turks. It's all about the Turks.
Okay.
You kind of learn who the Turks are and how they come about. You've also got Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII, which came out on the PlayStation 2, that starred Vincent Valentine, who's one of the characters later in Final Fantasy VII that you'll meet later. It was more of like this like Devil May Cry, like third person shooting game. It was really bizarre and
weird.
Not very good. It was something. In fact, we'll talk about that when we get to Blaze Knight's question. And then you had this anime movie that came out as well. And then you had Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, which was another spin-off game on PSP that I love. Like, that game is awesome.
I heard it's great.
Yeah. Like, it's one of my favorite PSP games. It actually holds up super well. So it's definitely worth playing, even though it's a prequel to this game. I would not play that before finishing Final Fantasy VII because it does, again, spoil some stuff that happens later in the game. So make sure not to play that first. As well as, of course, we got Final Fantasy VII Remake, which will get its own episode at some point. So we won't actually talk about it too much here. I played Final Fantasy VII Remake last year. I thought it was fine. Like, I was not one of the people that was over the moon with Final Fantasy VII Remake. My biggest problem with it was the pacing, because I feel like Final Fantasy VII is not a perfectly paced game, the original, but I feel like it's paced in a really good way. Like it opens up the world and the story to you in like a really well-paced way, I feel. Whereas Final Fantasy VII Remake just kind of like, it goes at a great pace for the first 5 chapters and then just like kind of like grinds to a halt, because this is the part where they start to add like some of either some cut content from the original game, or they're adding like their own story to the game, and it's really rough as far as the pacing goes. So I'm not a big fan of kind of the way that feels, because it just, by the end of the game, like, I just wanted it to be over, and it just felt like kind of a big slog to me. But I know not everyone feels that way. I know it's just kind of me. And this was something we talked about a little bit when we talked about the Dead Space remake getting announced on the Xbox Drive, where I wasn't super excited about that, because it sounds like they're trying to do the same thing with that they did with Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is one of the things I didn't like about that game. So there you go. But I know people really love it. Will we ever see the second or third parts of Final Fantasy VII Remake? I'm sure at some point. We just don't know when. The
next 7 parts of the game.
Yeah, to be fair, me saying 2 more parts is optimistic. Who knows how long this game's going to be, because they literally took like the first like section of the game, which was the Midgar section, and turned it into one game. And then the rest of the game is
insane.
Is already like a 35-hour experience on PlayStation 1. So if 5 hours is one game, how many parts is the rest of the game going to be? It's just, who knows?
That's insane.
Who knows at this point? I have no idea what they're going to do with the next ones. I'm excited to see what they do with it, but I just hope it's paced a lot better than the first one. So I'm excited.
Hope they don't add too much into it. Maybe like they really wanted to stretch out that Midgar section, just because it is a cool section. It's a cool opening for that classic game. For sure. And there's like, you know what? We can really consolidate and just do it one game. And I understand they probably added too much extra stuff, and I think they're learning from that as well. So hopefully the pacing is a lot better. After the first part.
And it's not, I don't think there's a problem with adding extra stuff. It's just the extra stuff that they added wasn't really super interesting. It felt like fluff.
I see.
It felt like
fluff.
It almost felt like anime filler. If you're familiar with watching anime, like if you're watching like the last like half of Naruto, the last 100 episodes of Naruto, when they go fight with like the flower ninjas or something like that. Like it felt more like that versus like part of the core story, and it felt kind of out of place. So
I getcha. I played the first 2 chapters of Final Fantasy VII Remake last night.
Oh.
And yes, and I think it's really, really good. Now, you say the first 5 chapters is really good pacing, so I'm on that high right now that this is a really, really good game. Yeah. Like, the first 2 chapters, I'm very, very impressed of what I've seen, what they've done with the opening sequence with Cloud and all the characters there. Yeah, I think I'm going to be playing it for a little bit now, because it's just so good with the gameplay.
The one thing I will say, though, Garrett, if you are going to play that and then also play the original is it will spoil some of the stuff that you haven't experienced yet from the first game or from the classic version, because what they did is started to wind some of the other elements that they talk about later in the game, in the original game, into the first part of Final Fantasy VII Remake. So just be advised for spoilers. Like, that's going to happen at some
Gotcha.
point. So
okay.
Just be aware that
Sounds good.
thing.
I did see some parts that with Sephiroth being in there, kind of doing some things in Final Fantasy Remake. I'm like, oh, they did that way outside of Midgar.
Yeah, they introduced it like way earlier, like the whole Sephiroth angle. And kind of talking about Cloud's backstory and stuff like that. They talk about that much earlier than in the first game, where you get out of Midgar and then they get into that stuff. So
yeah.
But
okay.
Anyways, we should start to get into some of these questions, Garrett, because we're 40 minutes into the show. We haven't answered like the bajillion questions we have about this. So first up, we're going to go with AskWhatNotWhy. Oh, also, I should preface this before we get into the questions. If you would like to have your question read on the show, because I don't think we've talked about it too often. Of course, we leave a questions post every Friday on the RPG Cave's Twitter account, so at the RPG Cave on Twitter. Also, if you're a part of the Yumi and Capri Discord, which if you're not, it's free to join. The link's in the show notes or the description of the video. You can join up there. You can leave a question for us there, because we put up a question post on Fridays as well. Or if you leave a question in the YouTube comments, I will go ahead and scour those and use those as well. So you have a number of different ways to have your comments read on the show, just like AskWhatNotWhy did. And he had a lot of questions
Quite a
for
bit.
us about Final Fantasy VII. So first off, some of these questions are spoilerific. And since you haven't played Final Fantasy VII yet, Garrett, I'm going to go ahead to cut to Future Ryan right now, who is going to answer some of these spoilerific questions. So Future Ryan, roll the tape. Thanks, past Ryan. So I'm going to go ahead and answer some of these questions in a more spoilerous sense, of course. If you don't want to be spoiled about anything, I'm going to quickly say, even more future Ryan is going to say a time code you can skip to right now. 50 minutes, 30 seconds. And then from there, you can go ahead and pick up the story from where we go from there. So AskWhatNotWhy. I'm going to answer some of your questions here. So first off, do I think Final Fantasy VII is overrated? I don't necessarily think it's overrated, just because, again, we talked about it a little bit on the show itself, or at least past Ryan did, is that I think that it was very much a game of its time. It really just revolutionized so many things about the gaming industry and just game design from back then, and inspired just so many other games that I don't necessarily think it's overrated. I will say that some of the fandom goes a little bit too far, and maybe you don't need. Some people are like overly critical of the game or whatnot. Again, it's very much of a game of its time. So it was really like impactful for people who played it in the moment. So I don't necessarily think it's overrated, but I can certainly see either younger gamers or people who didn't play it when it came out and then playing it now, or playing it even in like 2008, for example, might be feeling that it's overrated, for example. But I don't think it's overrated when you think about kind of the history of the game and kind of, what it stands for. What do you think it is about the game that has stolen so many people's hearts? I just think, again, it's the lovable characters, the dark and gritty story, just some interesting story beats, the visual design of the game, as far as kind of some of the character artwork outside the game, I think has stolen some people's hearts, as it will. But I think it's just a balance of a bunch of different things that's really stolen people's hearts. What is my favorite part of Final Fantasy VII? So my favorite part of Final Fantasy VII is just the big kind of twist where you kind of learn about Cloud's past and kind of like how he's kind of deluded himself into thinking one thing, but it's actually something completely different. Like, I loved how it just flips everything on its head. That was really like, it made you look at the game in such a different way when playing it. Like, I couldn't believe that that's what I was playing, where it was just like, wait a second, like, because Tifa kind of brings up the fact that, not everything kind of adds up here. And you as the player kind of start to realize and kind of start thinking back in your head is like certain moments in the game. And when you think about all of the different moments in the game from the context of knowing kind of the big twist with Cloud, you really look at the game very differently, in a very different light than kind of where you first played it, where Cloud's not this like badass hero that you thought it was. He was like a character that, tried to be that person, but just never ended up being that person. But he was there kind of when Tifa needed him. And yeah, I really enjoyed that part of the game. I thought that was really great. Although, honestly, I have to say also the Gold Saucer dates, the Gold Saucer dates with all the different characters, one of my favorite things. I didn't want to spoil it for Garret because I know he's still playing it. But the fact that number one that you could date Barrett at the Gold Saucer was incredible. If your dialogue choices kind of lined up the right way, it's a little weird and creepy if it's Yuffie because of how young she is. But I really enjoyed just how that dialogue choices actually played into that date. Also, we didn't talk about the Gold Saucer on the main episode, mainly because, again, I didn't want to spoil the Gold Saucer for Garret. But I love the Gold Saucer. It's one of my favorite areas in the game. And I love going there and playing all the different mini games. And especially, too, like, going back and playing Final Fantasy XIV now, they've added the Gold Saucer to that game. And most of the mini games from Final Fantasy VII are in the Gold Saucer in Final Fantasy XIV, which I love that callback. Plus, the music's the same, but it's this, like, updated version of the Gold Saucer theme. It's so good. So my favorite part definitely has to be kind of the big twist around Cloud, and not so much Aerith's death, which I thought was also just this huge list, like, out of nowhere moment. If you played it back in the day, you just there was nothing like it back when it came out. So I thought that was really, really impressive. Least favorite part, ultimately, was just have anything having to do with Cait Sith. I didn't really love Cait Sith as a character. And when you learn more about Cait Sith and when you go to his backstory, sure, he becomes more of a sympathetic character and you kind of understand more of why he is, even though he's a traitor. But you kind of find out why a little bit later on in the story. But it's just, I don't really love Cait Sith as a character. So anytime you had to go doing the story stuff for Cait Sith, it's not a fan. I just didn't really love it. Also, one of my least favorite parts as well is when you get your materia stolen by Yuffie and you have to go to Wutai and basically try and get it all back. Doing all those fights without your materia after kind of relying on it for so long made some battles really difficult, which I think isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I felt like that section just goes on for a little bit too long. Like, it's not really paced that well. So that's kind of how I feel about that one. Do I like the changes made in Final Fantasy VII Remake? And again, this is spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Remake, so guard your ears and go to the time code I mentioned earlier if you want to avoid the spoilers. I don't love a lot of the story stuff that they changed in Final Fantasy VII. I'm just gonna be just brutally honest about it. I just didn't love a lot of it. I liked some of it. Like, for example, I liked visiting more of like with like Aerith's mom, for example, and going to some of the sections that play out at Aerith's house. I thought were great. But I mean, the stuff with the little kids in Chapter 8, it's just, I'm just not a fan of that. The section right before you start climbing up Shinra Tower, I didn't really love either. And then the end of the game, the very ending of the game, I was like, oh, cool. I hope they just end it right here, right, after they kill the giant robot on the motorcycle, and then after the motorcycle and you still fight that boss. I thought that was fantastic, and I really love that whole sequence, but the Kingdom Hearts-esque thing at the end of the game where you go to, like, the Shadow World or whatever, and you fight Sephiroth for some reason, and, yeah, I was not a fan of that. I mean, I get what they're trying to do in retrospect, how they don't want to remake the same game and kind of make it more interesting for themselves as a development team. I get it. I definitely think that. Also, Nomura throwing his own spin on the story. Sure, I get that part too, but it was as an old Final Fantasy fan, and it's not so much that it violates the old story, but it's just like, it just felt out of place to me. And that's what I didn't really like about it. So that's what I have to think about the changes in Final Fantasy VII. I think there were some changes for the better as far as the stories are concerned, but man, that ending, I don't know if I really like that. It does kind of call into question kind of, where they're going to go with the story from here, although I think Nomura's on the record saying they're going to be even more faithful to the rest of the story going forward, and then that was to kind of set up expectations so that if they change something, don't freak out, because they've already set up the story to change in some way. Predictions, for example, I don't think Aerith is going to die this time around. I think they might kill Tifa this time around, or they might kill another character instead of Aerith. I don't really know how they're going to handle Aerith death maybe this time around, and that was such an impactful moment in the original game that I don't know if it's going to feel. I think it might be losing something if you lose that moment, that moment of weight, especially because of how it makes Cloud kind of think about himself more internally, as well as what they're doing and whatnot. So I think it's a really important part to the story, and I hope they don't mess with it too much. As well as some of the other ones, I think they're going to change some of the moments that have to do with kind of Barrett's backstory, as well as maybe just the original story with Zack. They might change some of that stuff around, especially because it kind of shows that Zack may not have died because of the way they may have changed things. Who knows? We don't know how that's going to work. But the ending, I was not a big fan of that. And we'll save all that for another day. So back to past Ryan with the rest of the episode. And thanks for the report, Future Ryan, about some of these
Thank
questions.
you, Future Ryan.
Yeah, so,
I can't wait to listen.
So, Garrett, real quick, we'll go through some of these that I think maybe that you're be able to answer at this point. So, obviously, number one, who's your favorite Final Fantasy character so far? Is it Aerith? Is it someone else? Who's your favorite character? Is it Cloud?
I've been dabbling around this a lot. I do like. Okay, so is it Aerith or Aerith?
So.
That's confusing me.
So it's actually Aerith, but
okay.
the original English localization was Aerith, and they just left it that way with the Switch version. But it is actually technically Aerith. In fact, if you play Final Fantasy VII Remake and you get to the part where you meet up with Aerith, they changed it correctly. It's actually Aerith.
Mm-hmm. So I enjoy most of these characters. What I don't really care about on a lot of them is how cryptic they are, and I'm sure it will reveal a lot more different layers as we go through the game. But I just don't know who they are, what their motivations are, for the most part. With Cloud, specifically Sephiroth, Cloud, and Aerith. Like those three, I'm just like, I have no clue what they're doing over there, and so I'm not going to worry about it right now. But right now, my favorite character is actually Barret.
Oh, okay.
And because he is just a very passionate, very level-headed dude, that he has two motivations. One is saving the planet, and the other one is protecting his daughter. Mm-hmm. And I could totally just empathize that type of character. So I'm gonna go with Barret. He is just he's a simple-minded dude. He's like, here's my goal, here's my task, and I'm gonna do it in style, and then I'm just gonna go about it. And he's all about the planet, and I'm all about the planet too, as you could tell. So yeah, I very much enjoy Barret.
He's like one of the most relatable characters in like almost any Final Fantasy game. You can totally get where he's coming from. He just feels like a normal guy, even though he's got like this weird like gun arm. He's kind of like Mega Man, but he's also like this like really chill dude that just happens to also have a lot of passion for the planet. So yeah, I think Barret's actually a really good choice. He's actually a really good character, especially early on too. Especially since you don't know about some of the other stuff that happens later in the game. It's a little bit easier. I talked about mine a little bit in a more spoilery sense on the spoiler question, but shorter answer for you, Garrett. So it's Tifa. Tifa is actually my favorite character in the game. She's also the character that I romance usually as well when I play through.
Nice.
The game. So there you go. Also, what is your favorite Final Fantasy game, Garrett? We can talk about this non-spoiler because obviously I know you have played so many of them. I wanted to ask you.
I know all of them. Okay, so here's what I've dabbled in, and I have not finished a Final Fantasy game. I've dabbled with Final Fantasy IV, now Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, and then Final Fantasy VII Remake. And it's just very little, guys. It's just, and just from just a refreshing, cool perspective, I really want to play Final Fantasy VII Remake. That's in my head, all the time right now. And I know I just played it yesterday, so it's just of course, my opinion is going to change a year from now, where I'm going to probably go through a few more. I really want to play Final Fantasy IX. I heard that's a really good one. To go after. 10 is by far, I don't like it. I just, out of all of them.
I'm with you on that one, Garrett. I'm not even
the freaking mini game and the character.
Let's ball.
I can't. I really tried. I played it on Vita. I think I got maybe 15 or 20 hours and I'm like, I just can't play this game.
Waka's your bro,
anymore.
isn't he?
No, please. Anyways, yeah, I'll go with Final Fantasy VII Remake for now. I need to finish that game, and of course, like see where all the opinions are at. But this is definitely going to change a year from now.
Yeah, for sure. I had to throw it to you, Garrett, anyways, because I had to ask. But for me personally, I would actually, for the longest time, I might have said Final Fantasy VII. I might have said Final Fantasy IX. I probably would have said Final Fantasy VI, but Final Fantasy XIV is my favorite Final Fantasy game, which shouldn't come to any shock to anyone. But again, the thing I love about it is the story, because the story is so good in Final Fantasy XIV. It's the best Final Fantasy story. So, I mean, if I'm going by just story alone and how much I love the story, it's got to be there. I love the combat in Final Fantasy XIV. It's incredible. The characters, the world, just everything about that game. It's so good, especially just after playing Shadowbringers, the latest expansion, which is incredible. One of the best RPGs I played this generation was Shadowbringers in particular. Such high praise, but well deserved. And I'm not the only one to say that either. So it catapulted Final Fantasy XIV from being like my second or third favorite between that Final Fantasy VII and VI to being my number one, like by a landslide at this point. So I have to say Final Fantasy XIV at this point is my favorite Final Fantasy game. And then as far as changes in Final Fantasy VII Remake, again, I thought the changes in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the story changes, I didn't love, but I loved what they did when they stuck to the story, when they modernized the original story. Like, for example, the section you played through, Garrett, with like the opening bombing mission and stuff like that. I thought that section was great, and I thought
that was fantastic.
I liked the changes they made to it. I thought that's really cool, even though I didn't love the combat system more than the turn-based combat system. I did really like the combat system too. I thought that was a good change as well. But I didn't love it as much as, the combat system when comparing Trials of Mana, the remake, to Trials of Mana, the original. I didn't like it kind of in the same way, where I felt like that was a big improvement. Whereas this time around, I felt like it was different, but not necessarily better.
It's interesting. I'm still trying to get used to it.
Yeah.
Because I like to... I think of it as a beat 'em up Koei Tecmo game, because it's a lot of slashes with Cloud. And like normally when I was playing Persona Strikers, you go between two different buttons. You go square and triangle for like light and heavy attack. That's not the case with Cloud. Yeah, triangle is like you change the modes, and I'm just like, oh wait, no, I'm accidentally pressing triangle, which I shouldn't all the time. So
and also like too that you like switch between the different characters as well, because you can switch between Barrett for like taking out flying enemies, or Tifa does like some faster attacks, and that's better against some enemies. And all the characters play really different from each other, which I really like as well. So that's it for all of Ask What Not Why's questions. I think we cover them all here, including a special shout out from Future Ryan, of course. But next up, let's bring in Mike at BlazeKnight0923, and he asks the question: Final Fantasy VII is a certified phenomenon, from movies to remakes to spin-offs. One such spin-off was Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 2, which I talked about a little bit earlier, starring Vincent. What do you make of Square Enix's choice to give a lead role to an optional character in this sequel game? And is this something we like? So, for me, I really liked the idea behind Dirge of Cerberus. Like, I liked the idea of having an optional character that we really liked kind of have their own game and kind of learn more about the backstory. Because again, it like expands the universe in a really positive way, I think. It kind of gives it more story to tell. Because if you do too many stories with kind of the same reoccurring characters or a main character, it can make the universe feel small. Kind of like what happens with Star Wars, where Star Wars, like focusing too much on the Skywalkers almost makes that universe feel small and condensed. So I think that from that perspective, I think going with Vincent was a really smart idea. The execution wasn't there, but I think they totally nailed it when they did Crisis Core, because Crisis Core, you don't play as Cloud either, and in fact, it has a completely different set of characters, which I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed that take of the game. It felt really fresh, and cool. It felt very different. So yeah, I like the idea of Square Enix kind of doing spin-offs with that. In fact, I prefer it probably more than doing sequels to games that maybe don't need sequels. The Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, for example, comes to mind when I say that, because they definitely didn't need to do 3 games, or if they were going to do 3 games. I liked with the sequel, Final Fantasy XIII 2, how they kind of focused on a different character. They focused on Sarah, who is kind of like the Lightning's kind of sister, and they basically told her story. But then when they went back to Lightning for the third game, it's just like, man, I wish you just would have done a different character or done something completely different with this. But what do you think about this idea, Garrett? Even though I know, again, you probably don't have a lot of context to this, but what do you think about the idea of introducing like a side character as kind of having their own game?
I mean, in general, if the character is interesting enough throughout the game, but you don't know like the full layers or background behind it, if there is some sort of story to explore, then yeah, totally. I think it's a great idea. I mean, you see it a lot in media, right? With, is it Breaking Bad? And you got the side character, Better Call Saul. And then you also got like a lot of video games that do this other than Square Enix. You know, right now, top of my head is Borderlands, and they're going to do a side spin-off game just based off of
Tiny Tina.
Oh god, Tiny Tina, yes, Wonderlands, and I cannot wait for that game because Tiny Tina is my favorite character in that world. So like, yeah, it's good to do it for characters that are interesting and you want to explore more. But if they're characters that are very subsurface and doesn't have much story or background to it, maybe that's not a wise choice to do. So you got to be very careful. You got to pick and choose which ones you want to do this in. But yeah, I think it's a great idea once it's executed very well.
Yeah, for sure. All right, next up, the most famous of all famous Seamuses on Discord asks us, do you think Square Enix relied too much on Final Fantasy VII? We have multiple games like Before Crisis Core, and Dirge of Cerberus. There's also Advent Children and Last Order. And let's not forget the cameos in Kingdom Hearts, Cloud appearing in multiple fighting games, the unlockable and sometimes pre-order bonus Final Fantasy VII costumes and weapons in some other Final Fantasy games, and now the remake. How long do you think Square Enix can rely on Final Fantasy VII before people get sick of it? So, yeah, I think that the way I look at it, and maybe the reason why I don't think we've hit that point yet, is because Square Enix doesn't necessarily have like a Square Enix mascot in the same way that Nintendo has Mario or Xbox has Master Chief. Like in a way, Cloud is kind of, you know, Square Enix's Mario or Master Chief in a lot of ways. So having the Final Fantasy VII characters or, you know, costumes and stuff like that appear in other games, when you think about it from that perspective, makes sense. And for me, I'm not personally sick of it yet, but I'm also at the same point too, where like, you know, seeing Final Fantasy stuff in another game isn't necessarily going to get me excited for that game that it might have done back in the day. And maybe I think Cloud coming to Smash Brothers was kind of the last time I got really excited for, you know, something Final Fantasy VII related in a game. Like I have I have a Cloud costume for my character in, you know, Final Fantasy XIV, and I'm like, I never wear this because as much as cool as I think Cloud is, it's just like, it's like really dumb. I don't know if I really want to just run around as Cloud, you know, in this game. So for me personally, I think it'll be a long time before people get sick of it. Maybe by the third remake, and maybe if that's not the last one, you know, maybe people kind of feel that way. But I wish, though, they didn't put all their eggs in one basket, though. I do agree with that sentiment. But what do you think about this, Garrett?
I mean, as you said, I think Final Fantasy VII is their like mascot in general. Those set of characters, and as you said, Cloud, that universe in general is what Square Enix wants to like kind of bring out. And that's the zeitgeist. That's how people got into JRPGs. Like a lot of our generation got into these Japanese role-playing games. So I mean, do I think they rely too much on it? I don't think so. I think they spread it out pretty okay, and they sprinkle it in with other Final Fantasy games in there, and then other games in general that Square Enix releases. So I just think it's supplemental. I think it's complementary. But I don't think I think of like Capcom when they did Mega Man, and they just released like, I don't know, like 7 or 8 Mega Man games back in the day, and it was just, that is way too much.
There was a
new
Mega Man game literally every 3 months on the Game Boy Advance. It was
it
was a time to be alive. As a Mega Man fan, even I got sick of it, despite the fact that I'm like a really hardcore Mega Man fan. Everyone knows it, so.
Right, so that's a little too much. I think they do a good job of just kind of planning it out, spreading it across. Like, you know, Final Fantasy VII Remake took a little bit to get out, and it's going to take a little bit for the next one to come out. I think they're setting the right pace. And honestly, it's like Star Wars, right? You do the main series and then you do a side series, right? And they do that with Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then now Final Fantasy 16, 17, whatever is going to be in the future. So I think they do an okay job of spreading that out.
Yeah, for sure. All right, last Final Fantasy related question comes to us from Hobby1K at Hobby1K. They ask, Final Fantasy VII Classic, I have not played the remake, is one of my least favorite main series Final Fantasy games. However, Crisis Core is one of my very favorite JRPGs. Have you ever found yourself liking a spin-off more than the original? So I don't actually think that there's really one that comes to mind for me that I like more than the original. Like even Final Fantasy VII case, I still like the base game more than Crisis Core. As much as I love that game, I still don't love it more. So I don't. For me personally, I haven't found that situation, but I'm more often in the situation where I underestimate how much I'm going to like a spin-off game. And
That's true.
How good some of them can turn out to be. But what do you think about this, Garrett? Do you have
I think this is a cheap answer, but you could say Persona's a spin-off series from Shin Megami Tensei.
Yeah.
You could say that, but then Persona has its own spin-offs of other games, so I don't know if that really counts, but I think I'm right there with you. There's a lot of spin-off games that are great, but I don't think there's a particular side game that I like better than the original, because that's how I get into the side game, is actually playing the main game first, and then if I like it so much, then I played the side game. So I can't really think of a specific example where that occurs in my
And it's also more apples
head.
to oranges comparisons too, because a lot of side games aren't even the same genre. Like when we talk about the Persona dancing games or Persona Q, like they're not the same as the Persona base games. So
They're very different.
It's kind of hard to compare them as well, and that's what we see with a lot of spin-offs. Again, like Dirge of Cerberus, like how different that game is from the base game, where again it's like this Devil May Cry like shooter versus Final Fantasy VII, a turn-based role-playing game. Very different from each other. So next up, and these are some of our more generalized RPG questions. Greg at Innocent Prinny on Twitter asks, do you hunt for trophies or achievements in RPGs? Is there a favorite or least favorite type of trophy? I'm personally not fond of collecting every item or anything that requires multiple playthroughs of long games. What is your favorite platinum trophy or 100%? So I play a lot of games, as people know from listening to our other shows. And as a result, instead of spending all of my time 100% in games, I'm usually more apt to just move on to the next game once I've kind of finished it, because I'm more likely maybe to replay it, a year or two down the line. And then if I'm really enjoying it, maybe go for the 100% then, rather than, really focus in. Unless, of course, the platinum trophy, for example, is like easily obtainable with just putting in a little more effort than kind of what I normally would. And if I'm enjoying it, I'll go for it. Like Persona 5 Royal, for example, is an example of a game that I have the platinum trophy for. That didn't require multiple playthroughs. You only need to play through it once. You didn't get the platinum for just beating the game. You had to go a little bit out of your way to get it, but it wasn't like more than a couple hours off the beaten path that I was normally going to go down anyway. So that's more of the type of 100% I kind of go for nowadays, versus, of course, when I was back in the day when I was like a teenager or a kid, I was more likely to go down the 100% route and kind of like maximize the most I can get from a game. But now things are a little bit different, just because we just have so much more choice now, so it's harder to justify that. But what about you, Garrett?
I mean, I'm right there with you. I don't know how these people play these games and it's like, all right, I'm going to play another 100 hours into this 20-hour game to make sure I get 100% of the trophies. Like, you serious? I feel like at that point, you're wasting your time. But if you're having fun, that's all that counts. Like, if you're having fun and going through the game and you think trophies is your part of your deal, then it's like, we'll do whatever makes you happy. But I'm right there with you that I just get the trophies that I can get, like it's attainable in hindsight. And then also, like, if it's a little bit extra, then I'll get the platinum trophy. The most irritating one I had this year was Persona Strikers. Oh God! Where, I had a good amount of trophies at the end, and then I missed one trophy. And I won't go through the specifics of the trophy, but I try to go to a previous save in order to get that trophy. But you have to like collect all the things throughout the whole game. and I didn't do that. And then I finally did that. I triggered that event in a previous save, and that still didn't give me that trophy. And I was like, nope, I'm giving up. I am not going through this whole darn game again and getting this this trophy. So
I remember those trophies being a big pain in the butt. Like I
Yes.
was not a huge fan of the trophy design in that game as well. So I hear you on this one. And Greg, I'm with you with your point. Like, I don't love, trophies that require, like a bronze trophy for replaying the game like a second time or a third time, for example. Like, I'm not a huge fan of that when it kind of forces you into that, unless it's a game like Nier where it makes sense that you're playing it multiple times.
Yes.
Just because, again, like, even though you've beaten it once, like, it's a very different playthrough when you play through it again because you're playing as a different character, you're doing different stuff, the story is different. So
Yes.
that makes more sense than a lot of other games. And last question this week comes to us from Adam Sandoval, I hope I said that correctly, at Anime Gaming Lift. And they asked the question, what is your favorite forgotten RPG series? Mine is Legend of Legaia. That's a shout out. That's a PS1
that's a deep
game.
cut.
Really, really, really good. So to give you some time to think, Garrett, I actually came up with a couple of some of my favorites. And I mean, I would argue that some of my favorite series that I've talked about on this show before, like Parasite Eve, like the older Shining Force games from Camelot, or the Lunar games, I think those are kind of forgotten. But I've talked about those a million times, so I wanted to bring 3 new choices to the table. Number 1, the Lufia series back on the SNES. Those first 2 games, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, and then Lufia Rise of the Sinistrals. I think those games are incredible. JRPGs on the Super Nintendo. Very rare games, too. In particular, Lufia 2, which is actually one of the most expensive Super Nintendo games now if you want to go buy it, like a physical copy of it. I think those games are awesome. I remember renting them back in the day, and they're great. They kind of fell off because they did a Game Boy version, which wasn't that great, and then I think there was a DS Lufia game, which also was not good. So there's that. Shadow Hearts, which is a PS2 franchise, which was all about kind of this like alternate version of the 1920s, but it was this like really good turn-based JRPG where you had like Tommy guns and stuff like that. It was really cool.
Interesting.
Very unique game. And then the last one is actually like a kind of a popular anime series, but it's Dot Hack. I really love
Dot Hack, yeah.
the Dot Hack PS2 games. Especially what I liked about them was they kind of did the Mass Effect thing, where essentially you brought your save over from game to game and your characters over, so your characters leveled across all 4 games together, as well as some of your choices and other like things really carried with it as well. And it was just a really interesting quadrilogy of games on PlayStation 1. The original Dot Hack games, the Dot Hack GU games, which are available on modern consoles, and I think that's coming to Switch soon. Those are pretty good too, but I really like the original like first 4 Dot Hack games. It was like this offline MMO that you played that just had this really kind of engrossing story. So those are the 3 I wanted to pick. But what about you, Garrett? What's your favorite forgotten RPG series?
Guys, you stumped me on this question, right? Because I'm a late bloomer with RPGs, right? Like my favorite RPGs, right? I think of the 360 PS3 era, and it's like when you say forgotten, it's been forgotten during that time. Like anything before, as you said, PS1 and SNES, like those are the games that are being forgotten. Like this, not the main tier, but like the second tier of RPGs in that region. That's what I think of forgotten. But what I do say is that I've played a few smaller RPGs that do get forgotten, and I wouldn't say a series, just games in general. One game I played a lot of was Felseal Arbiter's Mark. Ooh. And that came out very recently, and I think I'll put that in an indie volume showcase sometime later. But that flew by everyone's radar, and it's a very solid Final Fantasy Tactics clone game. Basically, I don't care much about the story, but the strategy of it was very reminiscent of Final Fantasy Tactics. And so I played maybe like close to like 50 to 60 hours of that game on Xbox. So yeah, that's probably the only game I could think of that seems forgotten or flew everyone under the radar. But I'm sorry, guys. I don't know a forgotten series that I played in the SNES or PS1 or 2 region.
There's a reason why I'm the Archmage, Garrett, because I'm the old man that remembers all these like really old, JRPG series that everyone kind of forgotten about. And I had more to pull from, but I just wanted to keep it short and kind of go with these 3. Because again, we might be talking about some of them on future episodes, so I kind of want to save it for that. But Garrett, we got to go. But before we go, Garrett, please go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Bland Explosion, and then you can follow me on. You know what? Don't follow me on Twitch right now, okay? Because I'm not streaming, but it's twitch.tv/Bland Explosion, and I will let you know when I stream next time, okay? It's not going to be anytime soon. I'm trying to graduate this year, so I won't have time, but that's okay. I'm also a co-host to the Nintendo Shack over at the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. You can support them over at patreon.com/PSVG.
Now, the real question is, Garrett, before we go, who ends up streaming first, you or me? Because it's been a long time since I've streamed too.
Yeah, that's the question. We should stream together. We should just do like a RPG. Yeah, just pick a day and just talk about, not talk about RPGs, just like go through a playthrough of something. I don't know.
We'll bring like Rhapsody, the musical RPG from the PlayStation 2, Garrett, and we'll
sounds lovely.
We'll comment about all the singing that's in that game. It's great. I remember Joe after work was spending a ton of time playing that game, which is funny. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You also find us on Twitter at The RPG Cave and on YouTube, youtube.com/Yumi Capri. And last but not least, on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been Level 12 and The RPG Cave. And we're out.
Bye-bye.